We might as well start by talking about George for a moment. As I'm sure many of you know, and I'm looking at a lot of very smart Beatle folks out there. I mean, right on the front row, Mark Lapidus, the founder of the Fest for Beatles Fans, our good friend May Pang. So we got to get this right tonight, and we'll do our best. The reason why George is so important, of course, is that at the beginning of Abbey Road, really at the beginning of 1969, during the Get Back sessions, which of course would eventually become Let It Be, George had been shunted aside.
Yeah. George was somewhat of a father figure to the Beatles. I mean, when they came into the studio for the first time, they didn't know the first thing about how to behave in a studio and what a microphone did and how the mixers work and what effects were. And it was George Martin who not only helped them learn about that, but also helped them with their arrangements early on. And as they got more and more adventurous, George Martin was right there alongside with him. So to be pushed aside in the White Album and then the Get Back sessions must have hit him pretty hard.
It did. He would sometimes trace that to the kind of genius that he was labeled as behind Sgt. Pepper. And of course, they felt like they were the geniuses, perhaps rightly so. To his face, they called him Big George because he was really tall. But behind his back, they called him the Duke of Edinburgh because he had a posh accent. Of course, they would later learn that that wasn't his real voice, that he was from the wrong side of the tracks. When they met him, he was 36, and they thought he was the oldest man in the world, that nobody would ever become 36. Well, as I think many of us are proud to say, you do become 36, and even older.
So January of 1969, the Beatles have just come off of the White Album sessions, and there's a lot of fragmentation in the Beatles camp. It's a great double album, but John's doing his own songs, Paul's doing his own songs. They're coming together for some things, and they're doing stuff by themselves a little bit. And their manager, of course, Brian Epstein, has died in '67, and the Beatles are looking for someone to take charge. And right now, it's Paul. And Paul says, I've got a great idea. Let's go into Twickenham Studios. Let's record an album in front of cameras, and at the end, we'll go off to some place like the Sahara Desert and perform a big concert that will be the climax of this movie we're filming.
So it turns out that didn't happen. There was also the idea, right, of being on ships at sea.
Yes, exactly.
Fortunately, that didn't happen either. And they settled, as you all know, for the rooftop concert on January 30th, 1969. But it ended up being a kind of triumph, right?
Yes, I mean, it's a great little show, and they were having fun at that concert. It was freezing cold outside, but they were having a great time. But I think by the time those sessions ended, I mean, George Harrison had quit in the middle, Ringo had quit during the White Album sessions, their engineer, Jeff Emmerich, had quit during the White Album sessions. George Martin was kind of dissatisfied with the way things were going. So at the end of Get Back, they didn't have an album, they didn't have a film, and I think there was a lot of question about whether they could really come back together and record something.
Right, and as we noted earlier, they really didn't quite have a producer. They were working with Glenn Johns. They kept Glenn on. George Martin, by the way, was showing up for much of the sessions, but there's a good reason. He would invoice them. So if he showed up, he could turn in the invoice to EMI and the Beatles and get paid.
Right, and I should mention, George Martin was not an employee of EMI at this time. He was one of the very first independent producers, right?
That's right. He had left in September 1965.
So the Beatles would hire him, or he would come back in, but he could invoice for all of that. And he didn't have to show up at EMI because he wasn't employed by them.